Uh, Jimmy started teaching Hebrews, I believe, last week, and Saturday morning he contacted us and told us they were on their way to the hospital, and I guess you know the rest of the story. Baby Mila came about 3:30, 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, and I actually visited yesterday afternoon. I told him, I said, Brother Curtis called and asked if I would teach Hebrews chapter 8. He said, no, I don't want you to do that. Okay. So I made an appeal to Curtis if we could to do something else tonight. Jimmy started a study on Hebrews chapter 7. He said, Butch, 7, 8, and 9 all go together. And he said, and those of you that were in the class last week know that he talked about that. How that it would be a continual study. It's the thought of comparing the story of Abraham to Christ, and I appreciate so much the job Spencer done tonight. It's a wonderful thing. We actually started the Georgia School Preaching class on Monday night with Brother Jody Apple, who's the new minister over at Dahlonega, teaching the class. And the one thing that he did, we spent time talking about the Old Testament. Make sure everybody got one. So I appreciate so much the opportunity to talk to you tonight on the study of patience. I don't know how many of you have developed patience. I have to confess to you that it's difficult for me, and you can just imagine where I've been the last month when I had pancreatitis and I was laying there in pain, hoping the pain was going to go away. I was very impatient. Yeah, I got some. Oh, here you go. Thank you, brother. And very impatient, waiting, hoping the pain was gone and that I was going to be able to get some relief. The doctor didn't help any when he came in. He said the only treatment for pancreatitis is pain meds and ice chips. And that's all I had for 4 or 5 days. Say a prayer for me. I'm actually going back tomorrow to see the surgeon that did the scope that brought the pancreatitis on. I'm hoping he's going to tell me that stone disappeared, and it's no longer something I've got to be concerned about. I appreciate your prayers and appreciate so much what each of you have done to help us in recovery, and I know those prayers are so very, very important. Patient God's way. I'm using James chapter 5, and I hope you have your Bibles, you'll turn over there. I actually brought the King James Version with me tonight because I figured that would be the version that most people would be looking at, and I appreciate so much just the fact that we can go back and maybe it would be a better title, How to Develop Some Patience. I don't know, I think I was impatient as a child. I think I was impatient maybe as a teenager. As a young preacher, I wanted things to happen rather quickly. I wanted things to develop and happen like we wanted them to. We prayed about it, and it doesn't always happen that way. Any of you got a good personal illustration as to how you've learned patience? Well, I think there's certainly some lessons out there, and all of us, if truth be told, we have probably found out. Somebody was telling me recently they were impatient. Red light didn't turn as quick as they thought it should, so they started because there was no traffic coming and there was a policeman watching. They found out that that's not something you do. I hope that all of us can understand that there are different things, ways that we have learned patience. But here in James chapter 5, James gives us some ideas by the inspiration of God that can help us in talking about developing patience. Here, I'll be reading from chapter 5, verses 7 through 12, but listen to James. Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it, until he receive the early and latter rain. Be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Take my brethren, the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord, for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, your nay, nay, lest you fall into condemnation. I can't help but recall something that happened several years ago, just about this week. I remember I enjoyed spending time with a lot of our young people, but there was one young man, Dustin Holland, that wanted to go on a dove hunting trip with me. And I remember that first Saturday of September where we were. I remember that we sat under a persimmon tree. And I also remember the fact that Dustin had never had a persimmon before. I don't know if any of you have tried persimmon fruit or not. It's some of the very sweetest and best that you can enjoy that nature provides after the frost. First Saturday in September is not that time. Dustin bit into that persimmon, and I can still see the look on his face. Matter of fact, I saw him last week, and he told me, he said, I can't wait to take Hunter. I can't wait to let him try his first persimmon. Well, you know, folk, maybe all of us have gotten a little bit anxious at times. I remember as a child, we had a June apple tree at my grandparents' house, and those apples, the reason they call them June apples, they're only about so big, and they're ready earlier than any of the other apples. Barry, I don't know what they're called now. What are they? You still call them June apples? They were always the early apples, but anyway, I remember trying them when they were still green, anxious for them to get ripe. Maybe some of you have done some of that in the past. Patience. There may be some ways we've learned that we need patience, but here I mentioned in the outline when to be patient. I want you to look at verse 7 with me. And James points out to us, and he tells us that, well, be patient, therefore, brethren, to the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth. You know, what he's talking about, of course, is this very thing about farmers waiting until the harvest. Billy brought me some corn back a couple of months ago, and he pulled it about a week ahead of time. I ate it, but the corn wasn't really ready to be eaten. Well, I've done that before. You just are so anxious for it to be ready. And how many farmers, how many husbandmen are unending in their drive to have fruit and have it ready? I think that's one of the things that all of us can look back, and that's what James reminds us about, how that they are waiting, and it tells us they have long patience until he received the early and latter rain. It's amazing to me, the farmer and what they endure. It always amazed me. I found something in the office this afternoon. One of the very first years that I was here, I told about my very first job was actually when I was about 4 years old, and I would take ice water to the field when my granddad would be planting corn. And you know, you remember those old jars, I guess they were pickle jars really, and we filled that thing with ice and ice water, and my grandmother would put that in my little red wagon, and I'd pull it down the road about a half mile to where the cornfield was. That was my first job. Ethel Watson wrote me a poem, and I found that poem today. I knew that it was there. I had looked for it a while back, and I really appreciated Ethel taking the time to do that. The Water Boy. That was my first job, and if any of you want a copy, I'll make you a copy and share that. I thank you so much, Sister Ethel, for doing that for me. But you know, I think about this. all of us can look back. I remember how that amazed me that you could take corn and you could drop it in the ground. And you know, you always, even when I was 5 years old, they were teaching me, you don't drop one kernel of corn. What do? You put 2 to the hill. And, you know, I remember having to thin it sometimes, but because I'd put more than 2. But, folk, that was the way the harvest, the farmer, they were teaching me even as a young man to do these things. A farmer has to be unending in his desire to have the crop. He has to wait. And I really appreciate the fact he hath long patience for it until he received the early and the latter rain. And then he goes ahead. Secondly, he reminds us here in verse 10 about the prophets. He said, the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. You know, those prophets were unbending in their desire to do God's will. And they, the prophets that he's writing about here suffered through so many things. You know, we found opposition sometimes. We go through maybe minor afflictions, nothing like what those men of old went through. And we have to appreciate that that's one of the things of when we need to have patience. Those men, those prophets were unbending in their desire to do God's will. In the face of opposition, they were true to God's word. And, you know, he goes ahead in verse 11, and I really appreciate this. When we're tested like Job, we need to be unheeding. He tells us, for behold, them happy which endure. You've heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. When you go back and you read the trials of Job, what comes to your mind? Patience. Why? Would we have had the patience that Job had? You know, when his best friends came and told him, said, why don't you curse and deny God? Why are you hanging on, Job? Why don't you just go ahead? They saw him suffering. He lost his wealth. He lost his family. He lost his health. He lost everything that we might think of as being important in his life. And even his wife saying, Job, why are you doing this? Job was unheeding in his desire to please God. He went ahead and he went through all those things. But then just think about the end result. What was the end result for Job? God returned it back to him. Think about how blessed Job was in the end because of his faithfulness. Folks, we need to be patient. We need to understand, yes, we're going to face opposition. We're going to face some of the things, not to the point that the prophets of old did, but we've got to be unheeding in what we're doing. We've got to have a focus in mind. And, you know, I appreciate that a great deal about our family here. We started talking about the growth plan for 2019 today, just a little bit in the elders meeting. And I appreciate so much our shepherds looking ahead and understanding we need to know where we're going. If you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there, you know. And that's so important. We need to be patient. We need to remember to be like the husbandman that are unending, prophets that are unbending, and like Job in not being unheeding. We need to make sure we stay on course and do what God wants us to be. But why be patient? That's the next question on your sheet here. Well, verse 8, he reminds us why we are to be patient. He says, be ye also patient, establish your heart, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Folks, we need to understand something. We better learn patience because God is drawing nigh to us now. I know that we sing a song sometime, and I realize there's even some people don't like that song. Jesus is coming soon. You know, when I sing that song, sometimes it makes me understand that he could very well come. We don't know when he's going to return. We don't know if it's going to be before we lay our head on the pillow tonight, or if it's going to be before Sunday, or if it's going to be, but we do know this. The Bible tells us the Lord is coming again. And we need to realize that He draws near, and folk, we better be ready when the time comes. Why? Book of Revelation talks about those people that would go out and cry for the mountains to fall on them, to hide them from the face of God. Do you know there's going to be some people that I know that have heard invitation after invitation, that have heard lesson after lesson, that know God's plan just as well as you and I do, and they've never done it? And if they heard the trumpet blow, and if they thought the Lord was coming tonight, what would they do? They would respond to the invitation. Philippians 2 says, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus is Christ, to the glory of God the Father. That time's coming. We can either do it now or we can do it later. But every mouth is going to confess Him. Yes, we need to be patient because God draws near. Secondly, verse 11 tells us, because God rewards endurance. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You've heard of the patience of Job. Have you seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy? God rewards endurance. What do you think of when you hear that word endurance?
Keep on keeping on.
Keep on keeping on. Endurance. I remember back when I was in high school, took a PE class, and somewhere along the way there had been a national test, fitness test, that high schoolers were supposed to have passed. And I remember it was something like we were to run 3 miles, we would do so many sit-ups, so many push-ups, so many pull-ups, we were to do all these exercises and things. And then I never will forget, they were going to test our pulse and check our heart rate. If you ran 3 miles, what would your heart rate be doing? It'd be a little bit high, wouldn't it? Well, folks, let me tell you something. It was really an endurance test. Anybody ever done an endurance test before? I was reading an article a few days ago about someone that had 300,000 miles on their automobile. And this article went ahead and it listed all the cars that were still running and the different makes that had as many as 300,000 miles on them. Surprised me a little bit what cars were on that list. But I remember in my youthful days that if you had a car and it had 70, 80,000 miles on it, what did we think? Wow. It was, and it pretty well was. How far do you go now before you consider a car wore out? 100,000, 200,000? How far?
When it stops running.
When it stops running, And they're made, it just seems like they keep on keeping on anymore, and that's wonderful. So I'm thankful for that. God rewards endurance. And, it's so nice if you're driving a vehicle and it's paid for, you might have miles on it, but let me tell you something. At least you're not having to make those car payments every month. God rewards endurance. He wants us to understand that He rewards if we'll just keep on keeping on. There was a story that I remember from my youth about the rabbit and the turtle. Anybody else remember that story? The hare? Well, y'all could probably tell it better than I can, but the story was that the turtle didn't move fast, but he moved. And here this rabbit is hopping all over the place, and what happens? The turtle actually endures longer than the rabbit. I think about, and I can't help but think of this every time I think of that. My granddad Jones was so slow. I never knew of him getting in a hurry. And I remember even when I was a child, piling brush or putting up hay, it just seemed like I wanted to do it and get it over with. He would work and he'd do more in a day's time than I could ever think about doing. Folks, let me tell you something. That's endurance. And he may not have been fast, but he worked steadily and he would get more accomplished than I ever could as a child trying to hurry and get things done. Well, I think we all understand. God rewards endurance. But then he goes ahead in verse 11, the last part of that verse, and he tells us, the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. We need to be patient because God is full of tender mercy. Anybody need mercy? We all do, folks. Let me tell you. If you don't believe that you need grace and mercy, we need to talk, because let me tell you, God is a God of tender mercy, and we need to understand it all goes back to our being patient, of our doing His will, of our drawing nigh to Him, and of our enduring. But He wants us to also understand that we can expect and enjoy that tender mercy that He provides. That's why we need to be patient. Now, how are we going to be patient? Have you ever taken a class on patience? Maybe at work, there's a lot of in-service and things done. I think now our teachers, maybe they don't call it patience, but they're taught to continue, to keep on, and to not give up on our kids, and to keep studying and with them and helping them. How do we develop patience? Well, here in verse 7, and let me ask, Jason, if you would you turn over to Psalm 130, verse 5 for me? I'll let you read that out loud in a minute. But here in verse 7, he reminds us and he tells us that we are to be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. We need to wait on God. Yes, sir.
Let's back up just a little bit. You talked about verse 12. I've got a question about verse 12.
Yes, sir.
Does that mean putting a hand on the Bible in court and swearing to tell the truth? I mean, it says just a simple yes and no will answer it. So.
You know, even in court, they will let you affirm. If you don't want the word swear, they will let you affirm that you're telling the truth. And that be the case. That's not the really what he's talking about here in the Greek language, but that's what we think of, because they want you to put your hand on the Bible and swear that you're telling the truth. Well, you can affirm, which means the very same thing. You are telling the truth before the court if you raise your hand, place your hand on the Bible. And folk, yes, it's an affirmation. We need to be truthful people, and he reminds us that we need to speak the truth. We need to make sure that our yea be yea or nay, nay, and that's what he's talking about. And I think that helps some right there. But we need to wait on God. How patient are we? I think maybe we're fixing to find out maybe a lesson on patience this very week. How many of you watched the weather today? Anybody? Why? You know, we got at least a Class 3 hurricane sitting up here off the North Carolina coast. They don't know where it's going. They can't know, but they can look at all the computerized models and everything, and they say that thing's going to turn southwest, and it's going to come down in the middle of Georgia, and then it's going to come right back up across us. And if that happens, we're going to get a lot of rain, probably wind. And Jason, you talk about it at work today? You won't have any power if that thing comes through here. Yeah. They already know. Brandon, y'all talk about it at the telephone company today? Not a lot? Hey, I tell you what, if you don't think it's already on the minds of people, go to the store tonight and buy a loaf of bread. You won't find one. You know why? They've already wiped it out. It's but I will say this. How many days in advance did they tell us about the blizzard of 93? About a week? And I know people that didn't go to the store. They didn't get secondary heat. They didn't make plans for the power to be off. And Jason, how much? Well, you weren't even working then. That was before your day. But I can tell you, some of you were without power for a week or two in 93. Folk, I hope that storm doesn't do that, but we'd be foolish not to pay attention to what's happening. And if you didn't buy your loaf of bread today, maybe it'll be there in the morning. But we've got a day or two to prepare. We need to develop the patience we need, because sometimes we got to remember God hears our prayers and He answers our prayers. Sometimes He says yes, sometimes He tells us no, and sometimes God tells us it's not in His time now to do what we're requesting. You ever thought about that? Prayers we prayed for a long time are finally answered. And you know, it amazes us. But look at this. God answered. He knows. And we've got to wait on God. We've got to learn to be patient. And it's hard to be patient. Why? I want it right now. I want to get my strength back. I have been running on about probably 5 cylinders out of 8 in the last month, and I'm ready to get those other things cranked back up and feel better and have the energy I need. Sunday night, I went home after services, and Susan had me a sandwich fixed. I ate that sandwich, and I went to bed at 8 o'clock. I never went to bed at 8 o'clock before, but I was wiped out Sunday. Maybe we can identify with that. We want what we want now. I never will forget as a child, that Christmas catalog had come about the end of October, 1st of November, and Rick and I would have that thing dog-eared in just a day or two, because we'd go through and we'd mark the pages of everything we wanted for Christmas. And we didn't want to wait to Christmas to get it. You know, that was the thing. Folks, God expects us to wait on Him, and we have to develop the patience that He wants us to have. That's what He's saying to us. You will read Psalm 130 for us.
I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in His word I do hope.
Okay, I wait on the Lord. You know, the psalmist tells us there, Lord, if you would look up Isaiah 49, verse 23 for us. Isaiah has a great passage on this, how we need to wait on the Lord. It's hard to be patient, but we've got to understand God expects us to be patient and to wait on Him in our lives. That means we keep on keeping on. We keep on doing what He wants us to do. We keep on. Why? Because He tells us here what's in store for us. Isaiah 49, verse 23.
Kings shall be your foster father, and their queens your nursing mothers. With their faces to the ground they shall bow down to you and lick the dust off your feet. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Those who wait for me shall not be put to shame.
Those that wait on me shall not be put to shame. Folks, let me tell you something. It's hard to be patient, but that's how we develop patience, is waiting on God. Secondly, we need to wait on God's salvation. That's what He's telling us in verse 9 here. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. God is going to be judging each of us. He's going to really judge our patience. He's going to judge how faithful we are to keep on keeping on. I appreciate so much you being here tonight. I appreciate the folk that come on Wednesday night, the folk that are here from when we have things going on and that we try. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 26. Barry, will you look that up for us? Lamentations 3:26 talks about waiting on God's salvation. And I like this verse. How to be patient. Have you got people you pray for that aren't part of God's family? Do you have people on your prayer list that you're praying for that's not faithful today, and you want them to come home and be restored back to the rightful place in the family? Folks, I'm thankful that it's God that's going to be the judge, and that's what He's telling us here in verse 9. We've got to understand it's not up to us, but we need to encourage them to understand that God's going to be the one that's going to save us or turn us away on the day of judgment. Who ultimately decides whether or not I'm going to be put on the right hand or the left hand, if I'm going to be a sheep or a goat? We do. And folks, we need to understand something. God's given us every chance we possibly could think about as far as making our lives right with Him. But we need to understand and wait on God's salvation. Barry?
It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord.
You know, salvation is of the Lord. It's not left up to a human being. You ever see judges that you don't agree with their decisions? Yeah, all the time. And I pray for our judges. I have judges that are friends and are acquaintances, and I pray for them. But I also see some people that make some judgments that I just don't understand. I don't agree with. I don't like them. And if you want to know, ask me. I'll tell you. There's been some decisions lately that just absolutely turned my stomach. But folk, let me tell you this, God is not that way. God is the one that's going to be in charge of our salvation. He's the one that's going to judge. And we need to develop patience so that we can understand that. And then last, we need to wait on God's rest. I like the last part of verse 11. The Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. I think about that old mule that my mom, my dad, and uncles used to plow and plant that corn, that old one-row corn planter. And I always used to be amazed. One of the things I got to do at the end of the day, they set me up on the back of that mule when it was time to go to the barn. I never will forget one time, I had to hang on for dear life. You'd think that mule couldn't put one step in front of his other until you took the gears off of him and it was time to head to the barn. And you know what he did? That mule ran. I held on for dear life. Some of you might have experienced that. We've got to realize there are times we feel like we're tired. We feel like we've gone as far as we can go. We feel like there's just, how are we going to make it? How are we going to get through this? He reminds us here in this particular passage that patience of Job, we've seen at the end that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. Rand, if you will, turn over to Micah chapter 7, verse 7 for me. And you got that verse?
For me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me.
Okay. Micah says, I'm going to wait on the Lord. He talks about his God. What a wonderful thing that we can look and understand that we're to wait on God's rest. Any of you tired tonight? Any of you weary? I can just tell you this. God's going to provide a rest for us. I know that we can look forward to the time. I think about hard labor. I think about how hard it is for some people, the jobs they have and what they do, and the fact that it might be hard for them to put one foot in front of another. But let me tell you, on that day, Revelation 21 talks about heaven, talks about the fact that there's going to be rest there. God's going to take away the tears. He's going to take away the pain. He's going to take away death. And he talks about the fact that if we wait on him, if we're going to have the rest that we need. What a beautiful passage it is. Do me a favor, John. Look up Psalm 37, verse 7. We'll close with that. I appreciate so much of being part of the class tonight. How to develop patient God's way. Yes, sir.
I've heard Brother Mark say this when he teaches Wednesday night classes, and I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I can be tired and everything, but when I come here and sit here and study the Word, I feel rested when I leave. I always feel better after coming here on Wednesday night. I might dread it sometime because I'm tired and everything, but I make myself do it. Yeah. And then when I leave, I'm rewarded because I feel better about it.
Amen. And I appreciate that. I have heard Mark say that, and I agree with you. 37, verse 7.
Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass.
Okay. Reminds us to wait on the Lord. I would hope that maybe this would help on patience. Jimmy, I'm not sure he'll be back next Wednesday. We'll have another lesson if he's not. If he is, you'll be studying Hebrews chapter 8, and you can look forward to that. I do hope you'll make plans to be with us on the Lord's Day, and let's do pray the storms go the other way.